Good day. This is the 32nd episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. And today I'm going to talk about the DTM theory of racism. In the next episode, I'm going to discuss other theories of racism. But before I start, obviously, remember the victims of the genocide in Gaza that is still continuing and that breaks our heart, whatever we do in the rest of our daily um things that are going on. So let me start by defining racism from a DTM perspective. I define racism as a global system of economic, social, political, and cultural institutions that organize the relationship between human beings on the basis of superiority and inferiority. You see, I don't talk about race, I talk about superiority, inferiority. And that could be based on race, it could be based on theology, it could be based on culture. And I'm not talking about feelings of prejudice, antagonistic feelings. I'll deal with that next week when I talk about other theories of racism. And it's also not about human interaction in the personal sphere, as you see in theories like everyday racism and white privilege. So we have an institutional approach to racism. And the characteristics of that approach is that we uh, see racism as the organization of human relations along the lines of superiority and inferiority in different dimensions of society: economic, social relations, political systems, culture. And we see that in culture there are concepts produced to justify the system in knowledge production. And it is linked, the different forms of racism I'm going to talk about is linked to the question of the authority of knowledge productions, and how then racism creates an institutionalized mechanisms for colonizing the mind. So what is the authority of knowledge production? That is the collection of institutions in a society that is regarded as the source of fallacious knowledge. So who is uh, who is producing valid knowledge? Now, today we are saying that scientists are producing valid knowledge, but there was a time in European civilization, particularly, where theologians, Christian theologians, were the authority of knowledge production. And you will see, I'll discuss three forms of racism: theological racism, biological racism, and cultural racism. And each of them is linked to a specific authority of knowledge production. I'll go in depth to this. I won't uh, go in detail to all the slides, so you could download the PDF of the slides later on, but I'll go through the basic concepts. Now, you have to understand that European civilization, the colonial civilization established by Europe, had two bases, two foundations. One was between 1500 and 1650, the first 150 years. Colonial Western civilization was based on Christian theology, and after 1650 is based on the European Enlightenment. Now, this has everything to do, the European Enlightenment, with the rise of the transatlantic enslavement, the European enslavement of Africa during the in the transatlantic region from 1615 onwards. That coincides with the Enlightenment. I'll talk about it later. Now, as I mentioned, the Christian theologians produced valid knowledge, and colonization as one of the people who came from Spain to Abya, Bernard Diaz del Castillo, he aptly says we came here to serve God and the king and also to get rich. He was very honest what he was doing, and his actions were justified by Christian theologians. Now, here is a genealogical tree constructed by the Irish Archbishop James Ussher. And this is a genealogical tree from Adam and Eve till the birth of Jesus Christ. And he calculated, because people could get a couple of 100 years old in the Bible, he calculated from since Adam and Eve, what would be the day that God had created the universe. And he concluded that it was on October the 22nd, 4004 BCE at 6 p.m. Now today we would laugh when you hear it, because you don't accept this as the authority of knowledge production. But that was the case in Christian theology. This was valid knowledge. And so in Europe, there were drawings about the people living in Abya. And here is a drawing where they depict the people without head, with eyes and nose and mouth on their chest, and basically asking themselves, are these animals, a particular type of animals, or are they human beings? And the general idea was that these are inferior human beings. Thomas Ortiz, Bishop of Santa Marta, he says about the indigenous people, they are like asses, stupid, crazed, having no sense, considering nothing to kill and be killed. They don't tell the truth unless it benefits them. They are inconsistent, they have the vices of beasts, are not capable of understanding doctrine, are traitors, cruel, vengeful, and never pardon, lazy thieves of low and mean judgment, are as cowardly as rabbits, dirty as pigs, they eat lice, spiders, and raw worms, have no art or human skills, are like brute animals. In all I say that never did God create people with so much vice in animal behavior. So this was a common view of how the Spaniards look at the people of Abya. And the church as authority for colonization is represented in a document called the Requerimiento from 1513, that the colonizer, when they entered and occupied the land, they had to read this document in Spanish, even if nobody did understand it. And it says, among others, acknowledge the church as the ruler and the superior of the whole world, and the high priest called Pope, and in his name the king and queen Doña Juana are lords in his place as superiors and lords and kings of these islands. See, the concept of superiority is there. If you don't do this and maliciously make delay in it, I certify to you that with the help of God we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highness. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall send and dispose of them as the highness may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage we can. So this is a document that formalizes the inferiority, superiority that comes with occupation, brutal occupation, and the promise of oppression and exploitation. I must be honest, there was also within the Christian theology a liberation theology movement at that time, where honest people with integrity, such as Friar Antonio Montesinos, who are seeing the horrors committed by the Spaniards, and argues that this is not wrong. And he says, he rose, tell me by what right and with what justice do you hold these Indians in such horrible servitude? With what authority have you waged such detestable war, bringing havoc and death never before seen on these people who are living peacefully and calmly on their lands? How can you keep them so exhausted and oppressed without giving them food or curing their illnesses, which were caused by the excessive work you have forced upon them and by which you caused their death, or more accurately put, by which you murder them? All of this so you can daily acquire more gold. Are these not human beings? Don't they have rational spirits? Are you not obliged to love them as you love yourself? Do you not understand this? Don't you feel this? How can you remain lethargically in such a deep slumber? Be assured that living like this, you cannot save yourself any more than can the Moors or the Turks who don't have or want the faith of Jesus Christ. So now he looks as Islam, as also a negative religion, um, but he comes up with a critique in the name of the crimes that are carried out in the name of Jesus Christ. So the genocide that the Spanish had committed led to a decline in the population. And because of this rapid and drastic and gigantic decline, there were laws introduced in 1542, new laws that tried to prohibit some of these excesses. And the law says, we ordain and command that from henceforward, for no cause of war, nor any other whatsoever, though it may be under the title of rebellion, nor by ransom, nor in other manners can an Indian be made a slave, and we will that they be treated as officers of the crown of Castile, since such they are. So they wanted to end the slavery of the indigenous people. Now, this is the context of theological racism. And an important marker in this uh, context is the debate of Valladolid. Valladolid is a city in Spain, between two theologians, Juan Gines de Sepúlveda and Bartolomé de las Casas. And they had to discuss the question, is it lawful for the King of Spain to wage war on the Indians before preaching the faith to them, in order to subject them to his rule, so that afterwards they be more easily instructed in the faith? So remember, these are people who had the authority of knowledge production at that time. So when they discuss, they bring forward their arguments. One is based on theory, and theory means they go back to theologians with big authority, notably Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and also Aristotle, who is not a Christian. He was before the birth of the Common Era. And they refer in their arguments to these authorities. And regarding the empirical facts about Abiyala, Sepúlveda based himself on the work of Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdez, because Sepúlveda had never been in Abiyala. Las Casas has spent 40 years in the Abiyala. Now, the Sepúlveda's arguments are basically this. The indigenous people are barbarians and inferior to the Spaniards, therefore a war against them is justified because inferior people should be ruled by superior people. The indigenous people commit crimes against natural law, idolatry, and the sacrifice of humans to their god. The indigenous people oppress and kill innocent people, and war may be waged against infidels in order to prepare the way for preaching the faith. Las Casas, who had some sympathy for indigenous people, says Spaniards can act like barbarians. Christians don't have jurisdiction over people who don't live in their territory. God is the only one that has the power to pass a final judgment. Saving a few innocent people by killing many innocent people doesn't make sense. The proper method of conversation and conversion in Christianity is not force. And he says the only way the church can justifiably wage war against unbelievers is when they would maliciously prevent the spread of a faith, either by trying to make those who had already received it abandon it, or by placing obstacles in the way of those who, in all probability, would come to believe. So he said, you shouldn't obstruct us in spreading our faith. If you do that, then we are justified in waging war. Regarding the empirical data, Las Casas says it is not surprising that Oviedo reviles the Indian with so many slanderous lies, and there are two reasons for this. The first is that he was one of those looters who went to the mainland in 1513 at the time of Pedrarias. They, before anyone else, began at the province of Darien, which stretches to the Gulf of Uraba, and laid waste to the whole mainland with complete inhuman savagery. They spared neither women, children, or the aged, and even burned men alive so that they might steal their gold, divide the other men among themselves, that is, enslave them. And Oviedo should try to make reparations by offering restitutions for these detestable obscenities rather than by his accusing slanders and shameless lies defame gentle and decent people. So he's saying, look, Sepulveda, my opponent, uses Oviedo, but his sources are unreliable. He tells lies, and it is also because he he was one of the oppressors. So he justifies his oppression and exploitation with lies, and he says, he should pay reparations already a few centuries ago, before reparations was on the table for discussion. Now, Las Casas distinguishes, based on Aristotle, four kinds of barbarism: loose and broad sense of the word, meaning any cruel, inhuman, wild, and merciless man acting against human reason; those who don't have a written language that corresponds to the spoken one; those who, either because of the evil and wicked character or the barrenness of the region in which they live, are cruel, savage, Scottish. So Scotland get, being treated not very well by Las Casas. Stupid as strangers to reason, and those who don't acknowledge Christ. So a barbarian is also one who doesn't acknowledge Christ and therefore is inferior. He goes into the arguments of idolatry and the sacrifice of human being and the eating of human flesh. He says Christians don't have the rejection of a people who don't live in the territory. God is the only one that has the power to pass final judgment. And the crime of human sacrifice might actually not be a crime if it is a sacrifice to God, referring in the Bible, the case where one of the characters wanted to sacrifice his son in order, for God. And it says human sacrifice occur on a small scale, so it shouldn't be blown out of proportion. And the eating of human flesh might not be a crime in case of hunger and extreme hunger, etc. And there's no evidence of cannibalism on a large scale. So, and then he says, on oppression and killing of innocent people, a benefit is not conferred on a person against his will. Saving a few innocent people by killing many innocent people doesn't make sense. Spreading the gospel is the aim of the Spanish invasion of the Americas, and that is obstructed by these practices, and God is the ultimate judge, not the Spaniards. His argument on waging war in order to prepare the way for preaching the faith, he says the proper method of conversion in Christianity is not force. Conversion to Christianity is a benefit for the converts, but that benefit cannot be bestowed upon them if they want it. They don't want it. The combination of force and preaching the gospel is ineffective, and the combination of theft of gold, rape, violence, and preaching the gospel gives a false message about Christianity to the indigenous people. These are, and Islamophobic obviously, these are not matters of Christians but of Muslims. Experience shows that force is not needed with indigenous people, and there's only one reason to use force in the conversion of indigenous people, and that is when they are preventing the spread of faith. Now, how did the indigenous people look at the Spanish invasion? Here is the story of Hathaway, who came from Haiti, the island in the Caribbean, and who saw what the Spanish were doing there, and took a boat and a basket of gold and went to Cuba, to the Tainos in Cuba, to warn them about what will happen to them. He says, "This is a God that the Spanish worship, showing the basket with gold. For this they will fight and kill, they will persecute us for this, and therefore they must be thrown into the sea. These tyrants tell us that they worship a God of peace and equality, but they take over our land and make us their slaves. They talk about an immortal soul and the eternal rewards and punishment, but here they are stealing our possessions, seducing our women, and raping our daughters. They can match us in courage, so they cover themselves with iron that can't be broken by our weapons." Now, he led a rebellion, eventually was caught, and was sent to be burned alive. And just before his execution, a priest came to him to offer him spiritual assistance. And the priest showed him a cross and asked him to accept Jesus and thereby get a place in heaven. And Hathaway asked him, "Are there people like you in heaven?" And he replied, "There are many people like me in heaven." To which Hathaway said, "I don't want to go to heaven, but to hell, because in heaven live such cruel people as you." You see how this guy, thought about what is Christian theology and what are the Christians doing, and they didn't want anything to do with them. There's another response of Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc in Mexico. And, when he was caught, before he was caught, in fact, by the Spaniards, he gave a speech and where he basically, was looking into the future. He says, "Our sun has gone down, our sun has been lost from view and has left us in complete darkness. But we know it will return again, and it will rise again to light us anew." So colonialism is going into a period of darkness for the colonized people, but he says there will be a time where the sun will rise again. But he says, "But while it is there in the mansion of silence, let's join together. Let's embrace each other, and in the very center of our being hide all that our hearts love and we know is the great treasure. Let us hide our temples, our schools, our sacred soccer games, our youth centers, our houses of flowery songs, so that only our streets remain. Our homes will enclose us until our new sun rises. Most honorable Father, most honorable mothers, may you never forget to guide your young ones. Teach your children while you live how good it has been and will be. Until now, our beloved Anahuac sheltered and protected our destiny, yet our ancestors and our parents enthusiastically receive and seed it in our being. Now we will instruct our children how to be good. They will raise themselves up and gain strength, and as goodness make real their great destiny in this, our beloved Anahuac. So there is a vision that the European Enlightenment brought an era of darkness, and what I like about his speech, the contrast between European Enlightenment and the darkness, and the idea that there will be an end to that darkness and a new world might arise. Now, one scholar, Castro, talked about the significance of the Valladolid debate, and he said Valladolid was little more than a confrontation between two phases of the same empire. One belonged to the colonists and was represented by Sepulveda. It demanded a free hand in the exploitation of Spanish territories and its people as the colonists saw fit. The other was represented by Las Casas, who advocated a more benevolent and systematic exploitation while positioning the crown as the overriding regulator of the exploitation of the colonies and the people in a more rational and productive way. So it's not about good and bad, who was good, who was bad in the debate, but the two faces of the same empire. And Las Casas, argued for better treatment of the indigenous people. Um, he supported the idea of bringing in enslaved people from Africa. And he picked up on the idea, and when he was back in Spain in 1570, he suggested to the king council that the license should be issued to import Negro slaves directly from Africa to the islands. He said that he later regretted the advice, but that advice was taken up by the Spaniards, and at the end of the day, the replacement came. Now, Christian theology, I dealt with it in detail, just to give you an idea that there was a form of racism, we don't see it now anymore, theological racism. The dominant thing that we see now is the European Enlightenment. But you have to understand that the European Enlightenment, which is now the base for the Western civilization, that there was a close relationship between the rise of the Atlantic, of the European enslavement of Africans, bringing them over the Atlantic to Abya, and the rise of the European Enlightenment. We see a shift in the authority of knowledge production, a shift from theology to philosophy and natural sciences, and that is the start of the European Enlightenment. And the philosophy then has a struggle with Christian theology, saw Christian theology as a hinder for developing science, developed this idea of neutrality, objectivity, and universalism, that science is universal and objective, and that ethics has no place in science. Ethics is about right and wrong, and science is about true and false. And then the philosophers opened the way for natural sciences to develop, astronomy and physics, etc., and also natural sciences, where biology used to classify human beings as superior, inferior, and it was all linked to the transatlantic enslavement. And that is where biological racism comes in. And the key thinkers of the European Enlightenment were hardcore racists. You see, Charles de Montesquieu, those who concerned are black from head to toe, and they have such a flat nose, it's almost impossible to feel sorry for them. I give extensive quotes in my book and in the PowerPoint. I don't read the whole quote, but Charles Montesquieu is a big thinker of the Enlightenment. He came up with the concept of the separation of powers for white people, obviously. Voltaire, about Africans, their round eyes, their flattened nose, their lips which are always large, their differently shaped ears, the wool of their head, that very measure of their intelligence placed prodigious differences between them and the other species of man. David Hume, philosopher of empiricism in European philosophy. I'm apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be natural inferior to the whites. Immanuel Kant, a huge figure in European philosophy. The Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above the ridiculous. Hegel, another giant, the Negro, as already observed, exhibits the natural man in his complete wild and untamed state. So the philosophers opened the way for the natural sciences, the biologists. Here you see the measurement of the skulls, and use those things to argue, like Linnaeus did, Carl Linnaeus, the biologist, founder of biology, to classify the human race based on biological traits. and he put the nature of the races, and describes them. The Europeans are gentle, acute, inventive, governed by laws. The red people, the Amerikaners, he means the indigenous of Abya, are stubborn, zealous. The Asiatics are melancholic, stiff, haughty, greedy. The Africans, have females without shames, craft, lazy, cunning, lustful. And this is a scientific classification. Darwin compares Africans to gorillas, and the evolution of man sees the black somewhere between whites and the apes. Arthur de Gobineau put up a treatise on the inequality of races, where he describes the white race as superior intelligence, the yellow race as mediocre, and the black and brown race as stupid. And you see how Jesus is changed from a brown Palestinian. You can see on the right how the BBC, based on the people living in Palestine, constructed this image, which is different from the image of the left, which are in many churches, where Jesus became a white Swede. Important to know that the Europeans' views of Africans before the rise of the transatlantic enslavement was they were seen as respectful, dignified human beings. So that's why I say from DTM, racism came out of slavery and not the other way around, as some people might think. Here you see one of the many images in European museums of a black man as a nobleman. Blackness is not linked to inferiority. This is a painting in 1500 by Belgian painter Jan van Mostert. Nobleman visits Queen of Austria. If another African prince visits European court, 1650 by Nicholas Beckham. Three kings, one of them is black, visiting the birth of Jesus. There are many of these paintings, which tells you that before the rise of the European enslavement of Africans, black people were treated with dignity and respect. And then, after the abolition of slavery and the colonization of Asia and the rest of Africa, you get the rise of the social science, economic, social theory, sociology, psychology, etc. And the social science now brings forward the argument that inferiority, superiority is not to be based on biology, but on culture. And the core argument is all human beings may be equal biologically, but their culture might be unequal. Everything, taking Darwin's concept, develops from a lower and simple phase to a higher, more complex phase. And Western society represents the higher and most complex phase of human civilization and culture. So you see that in the theory of social Darwinism by Herbert Spencer, Thomas Malthus. Spencer saying that the strong should see their wealth and power increase, while the weak should see their wealth and power decrease. That's the survival of the fittest. Malthus says that the increase of population stops at the boundaries of food supplies. The weakest will not survive. That's the law of nature. And because Nazism took over this concept, social Darwinism got discredited in social sciences. And then you get Auguste Comte, the French founder of sociology, and Comte argues that there are three stages of human progress in knowledge. The theological stage, which explains natural phenomena and life by personified deities. There's a god and there's a god of this and a god of that. Then the metaphysical stage, where Explanation is by impersonal abstract construct, an abstract God, a spirit, a soul. And the positive stage, where scientific explanation is based on observation, experiment, and comparison. And the West is in the positive stage. And then Max Weber, founder of sociology, Europe is advanced technological, economic, and culturally. Why? Because Europe has the best religion, Protestantism. Not crimes of colonialism, but the mentality of hard work, rational conduct, and economic insight has made this possible. So, and then you have in a Marxist concept the theory of the stages of the mode of production, the primitive communal stage, the Asiatic mode of production, the ancient classical or slave mode, the feudal mode, and the capitalist mode, which is the highest development of society, the highest stage of development. And the criteria for stages is technological, economic, and scientific development, not ethics. So here you see a very well developed society, Nazi Germany, economically, technologically, uh, but nobody would argue that this is a high civilization because of the genocide they have committed during the Jewish Holocaust. And a similar way, we would argue that Western civilization is not highly developed in a moral sense of words. So this is racism, but how that racism get embedded in all of knowledge production in the Eurocentric knowledge? First is this concept of a linear view of world history that claims that Western civilizations pretends to be a universal civilization, that all of humanity goes in that direction. That Western civilization is unique. No other society knew science, freedom, or rational thinking. And science arose in Western Europe and modernity, which is another name for colonialism. But before modernity, there was no science, no systematic production of valid knowledge about nature and society, no rational thinking. Only the West has achieved this. Eurocentric science is objective. There can be a bias, but bias can be corrected. And objective knowledge means that it is universal knowledge. The law of gravity goes for the whole universe, and the law of economics goes for the whole economic world. And because objective knowledge was from Europe, it didn't exist outside of Europe, the step towards superiority is now small. Objective knowledge is superior knowledge, and European science is therefore superior to pre-colonial science. And in this way, superior knowledge that came with white Europeans became racist. So the conclusion is the DTM theory of racism is the most comprehensive and coherent theory in my view. I'll show that when I'll discuss the other theories in the next session. So look into the book and the chapter on the history of on the DTM theory of history, or the DTM theory of racism. And if you want to support the DTM channel, subscribe to it, share with friends, families, and colleagues, encourage them to subscribe, get involved in discussions group, and if you want to make a donation, look at the website www.sandohira.com on how to do it. Thank you very much for attending this session.